Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 5.00, and in this lesson I'm just going to walk through and talk about what we're going to be doing inside of section 5. I've done videos like this for all of the sections, at the start and at the finish, and I think it's really important for us to understand exactly why we're approaching a certain subject in a certain way. And as you can tell from the title, what we're going to be talking about here in section 5 is synthesis, synth processing, and then the biggie, which is we're going back to creation. In section 4, we didn't really do any creation, but we're back to it again because, in my opinion, that's really the best way to not only learn, but to also just express yourself along the way. So hopefully by watching this video, you'll either know, is section 5 right for me and right for what I'm trying to accomplish right now as an artist, as a creator. Maybe it's not, but what I'm going to try to explain is that I might be approaching things here a little bit differently than where you've seen things done before. Maybe that's going to work for you. Maybe it's not. But hopefully throughout this video, you'll realize whether or not this is going to be a good match for you. So our goal, our overarching purpose in section 5 is to learn how to use Bitwigs, built-in instruments and effects, to create original compositions. Now, the real focus here is on creation and on making things to express ourselves. So although I'll be using Bitwig's built-in instruments, the same applies to whatever you have access to. And if, for example, you're not working in Bitwig and you're working in something else, or you have access to a certain number of plugins, by all means, feel free to use those things. But just remember that our focus here is on creation. And so for us and for my purposes and my process, you're going to see how using the Bitwig built-in stuff might be a little bit easier. But again, the focus isn't on what it is you're using. It's on what you're able to come up with at the end of the day, which is creations. So I wanted to talk about and define a couple of things because I know that having been online recently and just kind of following the trends, a lot of times I'm left scratching my head, especially about this word, which is sound design. And the number of times I hear people use the word sound design and speak specifically only of using synthesizers is quite remarkable. So here's how Wikipedia defines sound design. Sound design is the process of specifying, which I also like to say analyzing, acquiring, manipulating, or, the big word here is or, not and, generating audio elements. So the only one of those little choices that actually deals specifically with synthesis, I would say, is sound generation. So if we think about, the history of sound design just a little bit, and I know I'm going to get my facts wrong here, but when they were originally working on the Star Wars movie and they were looking for the laser gun sound, they weren't using a synthesizer. Somebody just went out into the field and happened to strike a hammer against a power line or something, and it made this really great zap sort of noise. And so what did they do? Well, they acquired that particular sound, which they were then using and were going to design for the laser gun. And they brought a microphone out, they recorded it, and that's what they used. So there was no synthesizer involved. And so the big point here that I really want you guys to understand is that sound design is not only synthesis. And pretty much from the moment we started working inside of Bitwig Studio, we have all been doing sound design to some degree. And section 5 is about synthesis, synth processing, and creation, not synthesis and or sound design, right? The big point is that we are all sound designers. We've all been sound sculptors, and it happens the second we start to use the digital audio workstation to manipulate and change any sample. The degree of change is irrelevant. We've been doing so much with audio effects and really taking our source samples and really going absolutely crazy with them and doing new and interesting things. Some of those source samples came from synthesizers, but we didn't generate those sounds, right? We already had those. We brought those in. So we didn't do any sound design. Picking a preset in a synthesizer and just using that isn't doing sound design. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with doing that, because there absolutely isn't. And oftentimes, if you're surfing through presets, finding 3 presets that all work well together can oftentimes be more challenging than sitting down and doing all of the designing yourself. And it can be a very creative, liberating process to go through and scroll through presets. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but that's not sound design. What we've done so far in this course has been a lot of sound design, even if it's just reshaping the amplitude envelope just a little bit. At that point, we are sculpting the sound. So I want to just quickly mention what we're not going to be doing in this, in case you guys were wondering. And mostly the reason for not doing these particular things, is because there already are great resources out there available. And oftentimes those people would do a much better job explaining these concepts than I ever would be able to do. So for example, the history of synthesis. There are hundreds of great resources that have popped up in the last 5 or 6 years that can really take you through the history, and it's a fascinating history. There also are great technical videos out there that explain exactly how all the circuits are working, and we'll go through some of the key features of, let's say, analog, FM, granular, additive, physical modeling, synthesis. Okay, there already are great resources out there, and I don't really want to repeat any of that stuff because other people have already done a better job than I have. And then, in my opinion, the other big camp of like video tutorials and information is how to recreate a particular sound or how to come close to something. And again, there are literally hundreds of great resources out there. And personally, I don't think you guys are going to get a whole lot out of watching me spend 2 hours trying to come close to something. Do I think I can come close to something? Yeah, I absolutely believe that I can. But how is that going to further us in our own creations? And you guys know how much I am a stickler about doing things your own, not necessarily following any trends, but just having fun and literally just experimenting to see what comes out the other end. There's also this idea that with sound design, that when you start, you're bad at it. And you'll hear a lot of people say, oh man, the thing I'm really struggling with is sound design. And in some cases that can be true. And again, this is creation. This isn't production. If you're producing drum and bass music or something along those lines and you can't get a sound that fits into that genre, then yeah, you're struggling to accomplish that. But you're not a bad sound designer. You're just coming up with sounds that don't fit your initial intention. And that's totally okay, because in my opinion, a lot of sound design is having an intention and then coming out and coming up with completely unintentional results. And that's oftentimes when I have the most fun, is I'm trying to make a particular sound and then I get something else completely crazy. And that's what I absolutely love about doing this stuff. Okay, so I'm not going to just go through and say, okay, here's how you make the Skrillex sound inside of Bitwig. Here's how you make the Avicii lead inside of Bitwig. We certainly could do all those things, but in my opinion, that may not help you so much in the journey of creation. And I'm also not going to favor one particular type of synthesis over another. And I need to really kind of explain my next bullet point here, which is getting away from the hooked on silent culture. I'm not specifically ragging on Silent here. I'm talking about any of these kind of boutique synths that become really, really popular. And a lot of times they become popular with people who are, again, a lot of times flipping through presets. They're not necessarily 100% sure on how to use that synthesizer or how all of the parameters in it are going to work. So whether it's Silent or Spire or Massive or FM8 or I don't know, there's probably 100 others I could name. My whole point in saying this is I don't want you to get caught up in that buzz. I don't want you to get caught up in that hype, thinking that one synthesizer is better than another. However, I will make this point. If you have access to a particular synthesizer, if you've just spent whatever it is, like the $200 to buy Massive, then by all means use that and solely use that. Don't even worry about following along here if you don't want to, but I want you to actually learn how to use it, but recognize that just because you have access to that doesn't make you a better sound designer than somebody who doesn't have access to it. Because every instrument, whether this is an acoustic instrument or a software instrument, and specifically with synthesizers, whether hardware or software, they all have such incredible creative potential, especially when you factor in all the processing that we can do, all the stuff that we talked about in section 3 and section 4, and even in sections 1 and 2 as well. So don't keep thinking that you need that latest and greatest plugin, because the truth is you really don't. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this video. So let's talk about our approach. And I kind of just mentioned this before. In section 4, we focused on the processing itself and not necessarily in a creation-based context. We really just kind of looked at the different ways to process audio, and I just went through a few examples. I never said how to use this or how not to use it. And really, there are no wrong ways to use any of the things I showed you guys in section 4. The only difference is that you'll get different outcomes, right? So if you do something that a lot of people would slap your wrist at, like you're a kid playing piano and you hit the wrong note and you get your wrist slapped, I would never do that as an instructor. I would never tell you you have to do X, Y, or Z, because you don't. The fact that you have all these choices means you don't have to do anything. You can do whatever you want. And part of doing whatever you want is what leads to really new and creative sounds and new and creative compositions. So in section 5, we are going to be going back to creation, mainly just because I also am itching to get in here and do some more experimental compositions, because I know how boring it can be to have to just work on specific productions all the time with deadlines and the like. A lot of times that really bogs you down creatively. And now this time, just instead of using samples, we're going to be using the instruments for our creations. So we've already been doing tons of sound design, but instead of using just some of the built-in samples as our source material, we'll actually get to do a little bit of generation from the start, which is going to be lots and lots of fun. So another thing I want you to know up front is that I want you to always look past the label. And in the case of Bitwig, also look past the presets. So for example, we're going to be starting with the E-kick. All right. And if you go through the presets, they have some phenomenal presets. But the one thing you notice is that every single one of them sounds like a kick drum. Okay, great. So I know that it's capable of making a kick drum. But for me, seeing that there's just a few simple parameters means I want to figure out how can I really push this thing to do things that it was never intended for in the first place. And so we're going to be doing a lot of that in this section. We're going to be doing a lot of looking at very basic parameters and basic synthesizers and figuring out how to flip them on their head. And we'll also do the inverse of that. And that's especially true when we get into like FM synthesis, because it takes literally decades to learn the nuances of FM synthesis, and we certainly don't have the time for that, and that's going to hinder you to create something. So in that case, we're going to actually take something that, in my opinion, can be a very complex and overwhelming and confusing topic and strip it back to something very simple so we can get back to focusing on our own creations. And that leads me into my next point, which is making it work. I'm hoping that these restrictions that I'm going to be imposing on you in the creation assignments will help to yield greater creativity and are really going to help you down the road, especially when it comes to something like problem solving. So I know personally that if I'm just using presets for something, and there's something, and let's say I've never, really actually tried to dig into synthesis or complex processing, or not complex processing, but just different ways of processing my audio, then I'm never going to know where to go. I'm never going to figure out how to solve that issue, solve that problem. And part of what we're doing here isn't just about making music. It's about coming up with strategies to help us in our everyday lives. And I think that when we work with these restrictions, it really makes us really in tune to looking at our environment, becoming more creative, and coming up with better ideas quicker. So for us, we're going to not go beyond what we set out in our creation projects, and we're going to stick to what we have, and we're going to hopefully solve some of the problems organically, and not just by pulling out, the wonder synthesizer all the time if our sounds aren't sounding the way that we might want them to, at least in our head. Okay, so we will be doing a lot of resampling, a lot of bouncing, and by the end of this section, some resynthesizing. So I hope you guys are getting excited for that. Last point, this section is going to take a while to go through since I will be creating the tracks right along with you, adhering to the restrictions and rules I've set out for the various creation projects. So I never want to give you guys something that I'm not going to do myself, and part of that is just because I really enjoy messing around and getting to be super creative, because it's not something I get to do all the time. All right, so I just want to go through a couple of final thoughts, and I also called it clearing the air because especially in the past 4 or 5 years, there have been so many myths and so many people who I feel will lead you down the wrong path in terms of synthesis and sound design. And there's a lot of myths out there, and a lot of these myths are designed to try to sell you something, whether it's a new synthesizer or it's some kind of education to become a master of sound design. The first one is, if I can't reverse engineer any particular sound, that I'm a lousy sound designer. And I know a lot of people who feel this way, and I always feel really bad for them, because even when I try to explain to them, no, you're not, you're just coming up with different things, they never seem to understand, or they always seem to really be down and always asking, why can't I get that sound? So if you're in that position right now, don't worry, I understand, but let me explain to you why you can't get that exact sound. In our ears, we really can hear details, especially if we've been doing this for any duration of time. If I sit down and listen to, I don't know, whatever, Cyril Hahn, I think he uses a Juno synthesizer, for example. He has access to a piece of hardware that is completely unique to him. Every single analog synth is going to be a little bit different. They all wear differently. They all have little inaccuracies. And that's part of their charm. And that's part of the sound that we're oftentimes trying to cultivate and replicate. But we never will be able to do that because we don't have that exact piece of hardware in front of us. And now in the past, like I said, 5 years or so, software, there is so much out there, whether these are plugins that are audio effects or specific instruments. If you don't have access to those exact plugins or that exact plugin, you're not going to be able to recreate that sound perfectly. It's just impossible. You can't do it. And the real biggie is processing. And people oftentimes underestimate or forget about this. Just because somebody gives you the exact patch that they used in a track doesn't mean that it's going to sound anything like what you're hearing in the final track, in the final composition. So even if Skrillex gave me all of his FM8 patches for his growl basses, I guarantee you those have gone through probably 10 to 15 different processors along the way. And so just because you get pretty close, or just because you might have the actual backbone of the sound, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to hit it perfectly, because there are so many additional parameters in the processing stage. And I want you to continue to think that just because you design a sound, for example, inside a synthesizer, it doesn't mean the work is done. It means you can continue to push it and take it in new directions with all of the processors we have available to us. Also, mixing. So wait a minute, there's more processing occurring, and it may or may not be from a guy with access to tons of plugins and hardware units. So think about it. After the track is done and after it's been completed by the artist, perhaps it's been sent off to a mixing engineer. And now that mixing engineer probably has access to a lot of other hardware and software effects that you may not have access to. And so they taken this sound that's already been manipulated and processed, and they only process it further. And then, of course, there's the mastering chain as well. And in the mastering chain, a lot of times there might just be some sweetening and things added. But again, there's no reason to try to reverse engineer something perfectly when it's going through all of these stages. And if you're just at that first stage of creation or even in production and you're just working on a particular track, you also have to know that you're going to be going through those various stages. Okay, and also don't be too alarmed if when you listen to sounds coming out of a particular synthesizer, like if you're trying to research some new VST synths to add to your collection, sometimes they sound like really good, like too good to be true. and then you get the demo and you're messing around and it doesn't sound anything like the sounds that you heard on their website. That's oftentimes because they'll take those sounds that they've created and run it through very, very expensive equipment to add that sheen, to add the things that our ears are going to perk up to try to sell more. And that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But just be aware again that there's more than meets the ear in a lot of these cases. And what I've found a lot of times is that I can always get very close to a sound if I am trying to recreate it. And it's a great activity to do this from time to time, but I also understand that if I just get close, I'm going to be happy enough with that, because probably the sound I'm looking to reproduce is a lot more complicated, or has gone through so many more processors than I'm willing to sit there and go through, because I know that I'm never going to be able to get it perfectly. And if you're not close, it's probably because the sound you're looking to reproduce originates from a far more complex form of synthesis. So for example, if you try to recreate like a granular patch that somebody has created, you're never going to be able to do that. It's just impossible. That is something so unique that we will never really be able to recreate it ever. All right. Myth number 2, preset scanning. I am not opposed to it. I personally don't do it, but if you want to do it, by all means, go off and do it. If it yields interesting results, if it works for you, do it. We're going to be sticking to Bitwig and not really using presets, but who cares how you get to your final result? The average consumer certainly doesn't care. And sometimes just finding 3 presets that work together can be a more daunting task than writing an entire track from scratch. So I have nothing against preset scanning. Feel free to do it. If it helps you be creative, then I really don't care. And myth number 3, and this is a biggie for a lot of people, having access to XYZ plugin will make my music better. And again, it's totally a myth. It's not better. It's just different. I don't care what plugins you use in this section or in your music, and I'm never going to say that any one is better than another. The goal here is to learn and understand all the possibilities of whatever you have access to. And we'll be using the native Bitwig stuff, but if there's a synth that you really like the sound of, feel free to go ahead and use that. I just want you to learn and experiment and create as much as possible. But of course, if you are going to do that, following along might get kind of difficult, but the philosophy will always remain the same. And just one last word on plugins and plugin buying. The thing I would recommend, and this is just my opinion, you don't have to follow this advice, this is just what works best for me, is it's really important to really exhaust all of the possibilities within your DAW first. Okay, especially when we're talking about creation. So if I know that I'm just allowed to sit down, I'm allowed to mess with and do whatever I want, I'm probably going to stick to just the built-in stuff in my digital audio workstation, because I know that there's so much that can be done, especially in something like Bitwig Studio. Also, if you are buying plugins, that's money, and that's something that, we don't all have an unlimited amount of. So for example, you just got that $200 and you did just buy Massive or something. If you've done that, then I encourage you to not only read the manual, but work with that plugin every single day. And my buying guide, if I was going to give you guys a buying guide for different instruments and plugins, and specifically software instruments, is first of all, get a demo. And if they don't offer a demo, or if they offer a demo with a lot of limited functionality, don't buy it, because they're obviously trying to cover something up. And I would never trust a company that's not willing to put out a demo of the full version for at least 15 or 20 days. And if you can't get access to a demo, then use that plugin every single day you have it. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with downloading and trying out demos. I think it's great. Feel free to do it. But at the end of that time, when that demo is set to expire, what I want you to do is actually sit down and ask yourself, is this something that I can't live without? And if the answer is you can't live without it, then buy it. But oftentimes, the bells and whistles in a lot of these plugins are just effects processors. And we have access to tons of effects processors inside of Bitwig Studio already. So for example, something like Massive maybe, if you scroll through the presets, I can almost guarantee you that every single one of those presets of the factory bank probably has multiple effects being used on it because it makes it sound better. But just remember, if you strip all of those effects off and then you go through and use what you have built into your DAW, a lot of times you can get very, very close. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to say about that. If you have any additional questions, you can feel free to ask me. But for now, we're going to focus for the most part on built-in stuff to Bitwig. And then maybe after the entire course is over, I can show you guys a couple of really, really cool synthesizers out there. And for me, the ones that I buy are the ones that I genuinely know I can't do within the host program. So for example, something like Reactor from Native Instruments is really important to me because it has access to so many things and so many different forms of synthesis that no other program, especially Bitwig, is going to be able to offer me. However, that being said, within Bitwig itself, there's so much creative possibility here with the instruments, and that's what we're going to try to tap into and explore in this section. So again, if you have any other questions, feel free to leave them below. Otherwise, let's jump into section 5. Take care.